Welcome. We're just going to wait a few minutes while we let people join. But welcome to our Faith in Action series, Confronting Injustice in Our Community. We're so grateful you're here. So we'll give it a couple more minutes. I know that sometimes people have trouble getting on, but welcome to our Faith in Action series, Confronting Injustice in Our Communities. Welcome to the Junior Board's first ever Faith in Action series. Today's panel is titled Confronting Injustices in Our Community. I would like to begin by thanking our Faith Committee, Chair Maggie Boland, and our committee members, especially Eliza Nagel and Brian Breedeman, who helped make today possible. Thank you. First, I'm going to introduce our panelists, and then Father Wayne will give an overview of the panel and why we're here today. And then the panel will discuss and converse, and after, we're going to open it up to questions for the panelists. Today, we are excited to have Pastor Nicholas Pierce, Rabbi Craig Morantes, and Dr. Shanila Kojo Moji with us as panelists. Each of them brings a unique perspective. All are active members of their faith and all want to better the world through prayer and action. Rabbi Craig Morantes is the senior rabbi at Emmanuel Congregation in Edgewater. He has over 17 years as a Jewish educator and congregational leader. He is revered by those who know him as kind, caring, gentle, flexible, a great listener, and a visionary. His wife, daughter, and son are active participants in their synagogue community. They host an annual new member party at their home and Sabbath in their backyard. Rabbi Craig integrates his zest for art and music into his worship. He is passionate about social justice. Last year, he, along with 3 of his congregants, joined the Americans' Journey for Justice march from Selma to Washington to support the fight against racism. He utilizes innovative and creative programs to engage congregants in building and strengthening community. At Emmanuel Congregation, Rabbi Craig will help renew and re-envision the congregation for the realities of the 21st century in our diverse urban setting. He is very involved with Edgewater Community Religious Association, ECRA, an interfaith association of religious organizations who work towards fostering friendships and understanding of other faiths and to nurture a thriving and just neighborhood. And we also have Dr. Nicholas Pierce with us, who is a pastor at the Apostolic Church of God in Woodland. He's a scholar, speaker, entrepreneur, and pastor. He serves as an award-winning clinical professor of management and organizations at Northwestern University's Kellogg School of Management. He's the founder and chief executive officer of the Volkey Group, a boutique global executive advisory firm. Dr. Pierce is deeply committed to civic engagement and philanthropy, serving as a trustee of the Field Foundation, Chicago's Children's Museum, Fuller Theological Seminary, McCormick Theological Seminary, and seminary co-op bookstores. He has been a fellow of Leadership Greater Chicago since 2015, and he has also been named one of Chicago's 40 game changers under 40. He has also been honored by Excellency by the White House, Congregational Black Caucus Foundation, Mustard Seed Foundation, Winchester Foundation, Coca-Cola Scholars Foundation, National Black MBA Association, and Union League Club of Chicago, among other notable institutions. But last but not least, Dr. Pierce wrote a book called The Purpose Path. I just finished it and it's awesome. You should all get it. And Dr. Shanila Kojo Muji is a professor at Bowdoin College in Maine, and she is part of the Ismaili community. She's an assistant professor of gender, sexuality, and women's study at Bowdoin College. She is an interdisciplinary scholar working at the intersections of cultural studies, feminist theory, and critical Muslim studies. Her areas of specializations include South Asia and Muslim diasporic populations in the US and Canada. Professor Shanili is the author of an award-winning book, Forging the Ideal Educated Girl, the Production of Desirable Subjects in Muslim South Asia. She is also currently working on a book that traces the transitional lives of Muslim refugees from Uganda, Afghanistan, and East Pakistan. She is a leader in the Ismaili community and is active in fighting for social justice. After the death of George Floyd, she became even more involved in racial justice and has graciously joined us tonight all the way from Maine, where she lives in a bubble on campus. And finally, we have Father Wayne Watts, who will be our moderator tonight from Saints Joseph and Francis Xavier in Wilmette. He is a chaplain of the Junior Board of Catholic Charities, and he's also an associate administrator. He has been a priest at the Archdiocese of Chicago since 1990. At Catholic Charities, he is known for his advocacy for the poor, serving suppers, and his love for the mission. Father Wayne is the sixth of 9 children and hails from Oak Park and River Forest, a product of 21 years of Catholic education and member of Fenwick's class of 1982. Father Wayne graduated from Marquette University and then attended Mundelein Seminary. From 1990 to 1996, he served as the associate pastor of St. Francis Xavier in Wilmette. He then went on to serve at Quigley Seminary and Queen of All Saints, and then St. John Birchman's in Logan Square. Currently, he is the pastor of Saints Joseph and Francis Xavier in Wilmette. Since 1995, he has been leading youth and adult service pilgrimages to Lourdes, France, where they volunteer and serve the French Diocese of Bellaire's sick and elderly parishioners during their time. If you know Father Wayne, you have probably been asked to put your words into action. He is known for his ability to connect people and get them to live out the spiritual and corporal works of mercy. If you come to a supper at Catholic Charities, everyone enjoying the meal and everyone serving the meal knows and loves him. Welcome, Father Wayne, and I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you, Noreen. Great introductions. I'm really honored to be on this panel with such esteemed people. I can say that I was on in prayer with Rabbi Craig not too long ago. I think we made history at Catholic Charities and had a rabbi leading the Catholic Charities prayer, and I was able to join him. It was really great. And I can also say that I was a student of Dr. Nicholas Pierce. It was great to be in his class, inspiring. And I've gotten to know Dr. Shanila Kojamoji only recently, but certainly am impressed with all that I have seen and learned and saw such great kindness. I'm really honored to be here as we go forward in these really uncertain times. I think it's good to stop and to have so many of us stopping our day and to think about justice and what it means to us in our own lives. They're very strange times that we're in right now, you know, between the pandemic, political polarization, economic uncertainty, and what blossomed and came to a head this year with the racial tensions, which I believe have been there, but have really exploded this summer, and with the injustices to the people who are on the margins. At Catholic Charities, we really have been striving to be present to the people who are experiencing difficult times. But during this pandemic, since March or April, a lot of our programs have been significantly impacted and have had to adapt to the new normal. If we had our way, I think if I had my way, I'd have these three beautiful people in a room together with those of you who are joining us on our Zoom call tonight. It's a new normal, and here we are. The pandemic has taken lives of thousands of loved ones. I have the great opportunity in the Catholic Church of the Archdiocese of Chicago to be with COVID patients as they're dying. There are a handful of us the Cardinal has asked to go. We had to be under 60 and in good health, and I barely made the cut on both of those. But it's really been a challenging time. So, and we think of George Floyd, who, if we look carefully on Rabbi Craig's screen, you see his name, his brutal murder, and the other recent racial atrocities. It is very real that there is injustice in our midst. So we come tonight and we think, how do we as a nation, as a world, how do we as people of goodwill and people of faith confront this injustice? I think on the weekend or just before the weekend, my boss's boss, Pope Francis, reminded the whole world that we're all children of God. I think it's so important for us to remember that. So it could be tempting to throw up your hands and say, what's happening in our world with all the negativity that surrounds us? But there's hope. I think the fact that I am looking at these awesome folks and that Noreen and the Faith Committee of Catholic Charities got this group together. There's hope because we're having these conversations. We're figuring out a way to respond, or respond with our hearts. There's hope because people still reach out to help the poor. Tomorrow night in one of the northern suburbs of Chicago, we're having a food pantry where we say all are welcome. It's what we call a pop-up food pantry where people can just show up regardless of their race, their creed, their need, whatever it is. They show up and we're able to provide to their needs. It's really something, working together. We're challenged to love God and love our neighbor. And I think there are many ways, and as we have this conversation tonight, we'll be able to do it. Cardinal Supich wrote an op-ed the other day on systemic racism, and he wrote along with religious leaders throughout the Archdiocese or throughout Chicago. Let me share with you a couple of lines from that op-ed that was in the paper in the Trib a couple weeks ago. For people of faith, it means looking at one another not as competitors in a cultural contest, as if the success of one kind of person requires the failure of another. No, we're called to look upon one another as God looks upon us, as responsible for one another, as children of the Creator who fashioned us in his image and who wants nothing more for his family than a life of lasting peace, secured by abiding justice. Or to put it another way, as Pope Paul VI did, if you want peace, work for justice. Systemic racism is real. And we, all of us, all Americans, play a role in addressing it. The Cardinal said, we don't need to look very far back in Chicago's history to see one of the most notorious examples of systemic racism, contract buying, the practice of predatory home pricing and sales that undermine the ability of Black families to accrue wealth as white families could. I just celebrated the funeral of a dear friend of mine who worked up until almost the week before he died, fighting for that cause. Justice is a complex thing. It's that last part that might be the hardest. But seeing injustice is the first step on the road to justice. Taking that step means being able to put aside one's fears and sensitivities surrounding the issue of racial injustice. We have to be able to talk about it. We have to be able to name it. We have to be able to accept it in our own histories, in our own life. So today we hope to shed light on racism, how to be an anti-racist, have difficult conversations. We don't have all the answers. I think in our planning, we certainly figured that out. We don't have all the answers, but this is the start of the conversation. And action that needs to happen for a more just world. You know, one of my parishioners recently, it's an older lady that I've known for a long time to be kind of more on the progressive side of life as far as it is in Wilmette. And she wrote a letter to the Chicago Tribune about her own, it was almost like a confession. Someone who thought she was on the cutting edge writes, we hear a lot about incipient racism today. Incipient, I'm surprised that the dictionary synonym is beginning, whereas I thought it meant underlying. In an attempt to be woke, this senior citizen wrote, I purchased the book, How to Be Anti-Racist by Abraham X. Kendi. I would have bridled at being called a racist, but now I'm not so sure. However, something terrible has happened to me recently, which blew a cover I never realized I wore. We watch TV every single night now, and sometimes, let's be honest, during the day. The other night I heard myself say to my husband, look at those ads. Are there any couples in America who are not mixed race? Later in the week, someone sent me People magazine. I found myself thinking, my Lord, are there any white stars left in Hollywood? Who cares about these black stars I don't recognize? And later that day, I heard myself thinking, every darn article in the paper is about black people. What's up? And then, I realized I was a racist. Not a racist pig, just a plain old, lovely, kind-hearted Irish Catholic racist. Somehow in the midst of these internal dialogues, I heard what I was thinking. As the kids say, OMG. And better yet, I suddenly, after all these years of life in America, saw it from the other side. A woman like me who never saw a black person on State Street or ever in the old Marshall Fields, a woman like me who never saw herself in any TV ad or any print ad except Aunt Jemima, who never saw a man and woman who looked like her kiss on the screen, who never had all her girlfriends to a birthday party in the restaurants in my neighborhood. This woman's existence was okay with me, and I never really thought she existed the same way as I exist. She was over there, I suppose, and I was looking the other way. I resolved to rip this awful truth, this original sin, out of my heart. How? By reading Ibram, by actually giving some of my money to black causes. But mostly, I will watch my thinking. I will catch myself. I will upbraid myself. I will change my mind. And if I can change my mind, I can change my heart. And I can change my actions. It is time. So that's from a senior citizen. I figured if she could do this, we could do this. And so I'm so grateful for the panelists to be here and really discuss some of these questions. I'm going to present some questions to you, doctors and rabbi, and invite you from your heart to respond. So my friends, prejudice is a preconceived opinion that is not based on reason or actual experience. Bias has a particular tendency, trend, inclination, feeling, or opinion, especially one that's preconceived or unreasoned. And anti-racism is the policy or practice of opposing racism and promoting racial tolerance. What, my friends, would you add to these definitions? Where do these things come from? Go ahead, Rabbi.
I'll add a couple things. Firstly, I'm not sure we can ever be totally free of bias or prejudice, but I do think with intentionality and with deep self-reflection and with continuous learning, we can grow to minimize it and to diminish its power in our lives and towards others. And taking a page out of Dr. Kendi's book, I don't believe there's any neutrality between being racist or anti-racist. You're one or the other. So if you don't like the notion that you or I are racist, then you and I must commit to being anti-racist, which is a regular, ongoing, difficult, but essential practice.
Thanks, Rabbi.
I wanted to add that we often think of race as a biological construction or a natural expression of the body. But as we know from critical race theorists, race is actually a social and historical construction. So we as a society, we have created the categories, and then we have placed people in those categories. We have mapped on certain characteristics onto certain bodies. And we do this so that we can distribute resources unequally. In essence, the racial system is also tied to capitalism. It's about distribution of resources, material resources, epistemic resources, aesthetic resources. And so to me, when we're thinking about prejudice, bias, and race, I think it's also helpful to think about the racial system so that we can identify concrete policies, concrete practices, and structures in and through which we reproduce this hierarchy. And when we've identified that, then part of our social action work becomes to actually work against these policies and structures. In addition to, of course, the self-reflection that Rabbi Craig talked about. So I think our work becomes multiply layered.
Yeah, I completely agree with what has been said. I first want to express my gratitude to you, Father Wayne, and to the Catholic Charities team for inviting me to join in this conversation today. I think that the idea of bias is absolutely something that we all have to struggle with. Bias makes us human, doesn't make us a bad person. Biases are just mental shortcuts that evolve to help us process information efficiently and save time. The problem becomes when our biases are improperly formed, when we make a mental shortcut that should not be, and then it results in discriminatory behavior towards someone else. Right? I may not be able to get a police officer to not see me as a threat because I'm a Black man. That's his bias, her bias. I can't do anything about the bias as much as hoping that we can disrupt that bias from resulting in discriminatory practice, i.e. the trigger being pulled and me being shot because they could not get over the fact that they just saw me as a threat. If we can lengthen the distance between biased thought and discriminatory practice, I think we can get a long way down the road. It's like having that boss who they speak before they think, and you wish that the distance between their brain and their mouth got longer so they would stop misspeaking. It's the same way in this regard to get people to lengthen the distance between their biased thoughts and discriminatory behaviors. Now, I would hasten to add that if we stop at individual behaviors, we have not done our part. Right? And this is picking up on Dr. Shanila's point about how racism is a structural issue. If we think about race in America particularly and how this shows up, this is not just about individual people resolving to do good deeds and be nice. This is much beyond that. Racism is synonymous in America with white supremacy. And that is a system that oppresses with intent. I would argue that as we discuss systemic change, that for a lot of people, this is actually not a broken system. There are some people who want to reinforce this system. Yeah. So it's not broken in their eyes. It's actually producing the exact outcomes that it was designed to produce. Yet, if we focus on just the individual level, we miss how insidious and how pervasive racism truly is as a system, and we absolve people of the responsibility to actually advocate for systemic or structural change, not just do a kind deed and be good to your neighbor.
That's really true. And Rabbi, you looking at something you wanted to add?
I think that there's a saying in my tradition: you save one person, you save the world. So we can start with ourselves and try and figure out how can we achieve the greatest virtue as a way of opening our minds and our hearts to others who are different than us, who may occupy the margins, who may be oppressed. And whether we are or not, we have to look within to change ourselves. But if we just stop there, then we may fail to create the synergy and that groundswell of energy that enables us to tackle the larger systemic problems. So all of us are smarter than one of us. So if we're each individually doing the work and then we realize we can do so together, then I think we get to the best possible place.
Thank you very much for your responses. I think that they're very thoughtful. And as you were speaking, Dr. Nicholas, I was thinking about an image I have in my mind, and I've seen the photograph in different places of, 60 years ago. Father Hesburgh, who was then maybe one of the most powerful Catholics besides the Pope in the world, standing arm in arm, holding hands with Dr. King. But here we are in 2020. And although we try, the systems continue. I don't know if Dr. Shanili, if you wanted to add anything to that.
Yes, and I think the systems continue also because, as Dr. Nicholas pointed to, it is about a distribution or a redistribution of resources ultimately. And so we're actually talking about a careful consideration of privileges that we share. And of course, this conversation is about race, but intersectionality theorists, Black feminists have already pointed out to us for us to actually do critical analytic work, we have to think about race in conversation with class, in conversation with gender. And so there are multiple privileges at play. And so if we want to produce social change in our communities, we have to be able to think through these entanglements and what that means for us, what that means for societal institutions to move towards a redistribution of resources.
Thanks much. Going back to my friend, my parishioner, writing that kind of confessional, it was a public confession to the people of Chicago through the Chicago Tribune. I wonder if we think in our own lives how we can do our own self-reflection about our own biases, about our own prejudices, about our own racism. If we have that spirit of confession in our own lives, how can we make sure that we're using that spirit of confession, asking for forgiveness for the wrongs we have knowingly and unknowingly committed?
Well, I think there's a lot of ignorance and misinformation out there that causes us to be blind to our own sin. A lot of us are setting the bar for what progress or righteousness should look like using the wrong standard. So for example, even thinking about the idea of racial tolerance, I think is the wrong standard. Who among us wants to be tolerated? If I were to say, Father Wayne, I tolerate your presence.
Well, thank you.
Yes. You're the moderator, so you're going to be okay with that because you can just kick me out of the room. But in real life, being tolerated when your very presence is a fact is not a good place to be. Tolerance and equity are very different notions. Equity and justice are very different than tolerance. And I'm not clear where in the scriptures Jesus says, love the Lord your God with all your mind, your heart, your soul, and your strength, and tolerate your neighbor. It is love your neighbor, right? And I would argue that our love of neighbor is often diminished because our love of God is so weak. We view God in this very, very consumeristic, utilitarian way, where God is the answer for our sickness or for our need, but not really a God with whom we can be in relationship, a God who loves us, and in the Christian expression, gave us the highest and greatest gift in Christ. If we don't love that God, then how we love God's creation will be warped. And I would argue then that, the whole point to your question about confession and such, you can only authentically confess sin that you have agreed with God you have committed. And as long as there's any question about whether or not we are complicit in not only personal sin, but institutional sin, structural sin, then confession won't happen. We have to see it clearly.
That's great. And it's interesting, if I can just share with you a comment from one of the attendees, Dr. Pierce, the comment about Father Wayne being able to remove you from the room, although a lighthearted comment, reminds me how racial inequities are able to prevail because of power differentials.
That's the part nobody wants to talk about. This is about power. And I appreciate that comment. I was more referring to Father Wayne's moderator capabilities than the racial difference. And I know that came through clearly in the question, but I think that is only underscoring the fact that this is not just about nice people reading good books and having book club conversations and resolving to be better individuals. There is a power story that oftentimes gets overlooked. Right? This is not just about confronting one's unconscious biases and resolving to read the right books. This is about looking at how systems are constructed and using one's power to accomplish change in the face of systemic and substantial efforts to the contrary, right? And that is not only a power story, it is a spiritual conversation, which is why I'm so delighted to be here, having this conversation in theological shared space about this, not just as a sociological or psychological issue, but as a spiritual one.
Yes. I always say, I often end a lot of my homilies saying, if we can change our heart, then we can change the world. Change our hearts, we change the world. Rabbi, you seem like you were going to say something.
Thank you, Father Wayne. Firstly, let me thank you and Catholic Charities and Noreen Russo for your hospitality and collecting us, and Dr. Nicholas, Dr. Shanila. It is a pleasure to stand with you and with Father Wayne in the spirit of interfaith fellowship and the pursuit of justice through anti-racism. That is a fight worth staying in, and I'm glad that we are warriors together. I think this is one of the most important questions we'll consider tonight. And Dr. Nicholas, I appreciate the theological framework in which you've set us up here. I would add to that a framework of virtue, particularly humility, which I think is vital for confession, right? Knowing that we possess the power to make missteps, in this case, to act in racist ways, requires a certain baseline humility to say, okay, this may be part of my biological potential or some kind of cultural imprint, and I may not be always aware of my misdoings, and I may actually act in a racist fashion and not know it. And so to be confronted by it gives us the chance, right, to say, hey, I understand that I may have hurt you, and I'd like to learn more how. To do that requires humility. So we let our guards down, so we don't act so fragilely, so that we act with a certain openness to somebody else's pain. That's where we build empathy. And by the way, empathy is not a natural byproduct of our humanity either. We have to work at it, because usually we like to be empathetic, but to people we know, people who are not strangers, people who are not a threat to us, family, friends, people that we trust, we will take care of. There is evolutionary value to doing so. But that's not enough. So thank goodness we have God, and we have scripture, and we have values that come out of our sacred teachings that understand our tendencies and shape us to be, as what we call in my tradition, mensches, human beings who understand how to do the right thing and make good choices to maximize doing the good thing. I have a short story to share, and then turn it over to Dr. Shanila for your wisdom. One of my favorite places to go to figure out how to be anti-racist is the Museum of Tolerance in Los Angeles. By the way, Dr. Nicholas, I understand that it's a strange name for a place that really is trying to help position ourselves to celebrate that which is truly unique about every human being. This is not an act of tolerance. It's an act of celebration. It's an act of respect. And I wish they would change the name, but that's a slight digression. So I'll get back to my story. It happens at the Museum of Tolerance. It's something that I witnessed, but also something that none other than the Dalai Lama, His Holiness, experienced. One day, the Dalai Lama went into the Museum of Tolerance, and he came across two doors. Above one door, it said prejudiced. Above the other door, it said not prejudiced. Now, the handlers of the Dalai Lama were very concerned that he should walk through the door that said prejudiced, and that he would perhaps be insulted by that experience. It turns out that the Dalai Lama was having none of that. I should tell you, by the way, so the story makes maximum sense, the door that says prejudice is the only door that's unlocked. The door that says not prejudice is locked. And so I couldn't go through that door. The Dalai Lama couldn't go through that door. And so you end up going through the prejudice door, and you learn all sorts of things under the sun that reflect bias and prejudice and racism and sexism and anti-Semitism, Islamophobia. Did I forget anything? There must be a list. 20 more things. You start to confront and recognize. Now, that's not enough, right? Because anybody could go through there and take it in like it's a museum. The confession comes in when we truly confront our prejudice. And by confessing that prejudice, we disrupt it. We disrupt it internally, but then I also think we have another step in the spirit of community and communal responsibility and accountability. We have to confess it out loud. Just like the letter you reflected, Father Wayne. It was a public confessional. I think it holds more weight. We can all privately confess, and God, we hope, will forgive us. And that's powerful in its own right. But if we really want to make a difference, if we really want to be a force for good and change the world, we must no longer remain silent, as my virtual background indicates. If we really want true change. That's plenty. Dr. Shanila. I'm sharing the moderation now, Father Wayne.
Yeah.
Happy to share.
I think both of these comments reminded me or kind of reiterated how our faith actually provides us guidance, not only in terms of our interpersonal engagements, but also thinking about systems. And so I pulled up a quote from the first Shia Imam, Imam Ali ibn Abi Talib. And this is a letter that he wrote to a governor. He was assigned to be a governor in Egypt at a time where there was lots of corruption. And so it's a piece of instruction that comes down to Muslims, which provides a lot of instruction to us in terms of what good governance might look like. What is the responsibility of a ruler? What is the responsibility of subjects, right? And so this letter has lots of interesting gems, but I wanted to read out one quote in particular that again, I think it reiterates how our faith actually does provide us with a lot of resources for us to engage in anti-Black racism, to confront it. It says, pay particular attention to the lowest class, those who have no wherewithal, the destitute, the needy, the afflicted, the disabled. Assign to them a portion from your public treasury. Treat these people in a manner such that God may excuse you on the day you meet him, for they are in more need of justice from you than any other among your subjects. And so privileging those on the margins as a crucial responsibility for those in power, it speaks a lot to our current moment too, right? As we are in the midst of elections and we're thinking about racism, to think about what are the values that should underpin our political activism, faith-inspired ethics that can underpin our everyday actions.
This is really fun listening to Dr. Shanila and Rabbi Craig.
Yeah.
And what I just heard both of them say, in terms of connecting the individual spirituality with the public expression, led me to think about what Jesus says in the scriptures at the inauguration of his ministry. He's quoting Isaiah 61, and I know I'm getting into Rabbi Craig's territory with this, so bail me out where appropriate. But Jesus says, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, he's anointed me to preach good news to the poor, recovery of sight to the blind, to set at liberty captives, and to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord, the year of the Lord's favor, right? And so this idea of a Jubilee year, my understanding of it is that this is a year where it's not just about individual good deeds, it's about a release that is granted to individuals who find themselves essentially trapped in a system of oppression, right? And this is where I'll really lean on the rabbi who's having technical difficulties at the moment. My understanding is that, and this is supposed to be on the 49th year, in order for this to happen, in order for the Jubilee year to be proclaimed, it first must be preceded by a day of atonement, right? And if in fact there has to be a day of atonement, there is this confessional aspect of saying before God and before community, wrong has been done and it has begun with me, but it hasn't ended with me. That then gives way to this year of Jubilee where debts are canceled and people who are trapped in systems of oppression experience release, and perhaps even, restoration. And I think there is the connection between the corporate justice, if you will, and the individual and communal confession and seeking of atonement. The close linkage there, I think, is something that we can't afford to miss.
Thank you, Dr. Nicholas. Might I add one thing? First of all, excellent read on Isaiah 61. We share that domain, my friend. So
We do.
have at it anytime you want. I learned plenty from you both, and you, Father Wayne, as well. I think that what concerns Isaiah, particularly as it relates to relieving suffering, is that the ancient sacrifices, which were the domain of the priests, the ancient Kohanim, the ancient priests, felt that wasn't enough, right? Because the priests do their thing in the ancient synagogue, which did not democratize the efforts among the people, giving each individual and each community the responsibility ultimately to find the antidote to that suffering and to take personal and collective responsibility, to see themselves as the force for good. So through the use of their words, right? Use your words to speak out against oppression, racism and otherwise, poverty, what have you. Use your words and your actions. Words and actions. Confessional is partly words and partly a change in behavior, right? And if we're going to do that, it's going to make a much bigger difference than taking the sacrifice to the priest in the ancient temple and have that person work on behalf of everybody. Not dismissing the significance of the Kohanim or their sacred practices. But the beauty of Isaiah is that I think he's saying, don't think that it's not about you and me and each of us as individuals in some kind of collective synergistic moral effort to be a force for good and to fight against racism and to champion anti-racism. Thank you for the platform.
Thanks. No, this is really something. I'm real impressed, and I think our participants are engaged. Just a reminder to the participants, maybe we should have mentioned at the beginning that after we have a few formal questions, we're going to invite the participants, and there are plenty of you. If you have questions or comments, you can put those in the question and answer box, and we hope to attend to those towards the end of our presentation today. So again, thank you to the panelists. You're really opening my eyes, and I'm sure opening those of those who are joining us tonight. And I think this is beautiful. I think looking at you and having met you before this and worked with you, I just think it's something quite special. And we're working together. The question, though, is, as we think about partisanship, it seems to be so driven by bias and prejudice. Partisanship sometimes, I think, doesn't see the other as human and isn't able to live in the gray area or within the spectrum. So I guess here we are in this time of, I think I've used the term polarization in my writings and in my homily more this year than I ever have in my 30 years of being a priest. So in this time, how do we have these difficult conversations about racism and prejudice and equity with our family, our friends, our coworkers? This is the tough question.
Who won the coin flip for this question?
I think you got it, Rabbi.
Well, I can start by saying that it's not going to be completely easy to navigate these conversations. But I do think it starts in part with a basic recognition of everybody's humanity. I realize that is risky because there's some people in their humanity that reflect values that we would never embrace whatsoever. But I'm not sure how we're supposed to engage with them if we're not going to talk at all. So remember, humility and courage, these are important virtues that we must utilize when we approach those who we feel express racism or act racism out in their lives. But remembering that they are human beings. And I would take a cue from both my colleagues here, Dr. Shanila and Dr. Nicholas have talked a lot about racism and its systemic realities, and that invites conversations about policies. So maybe the conversation about policies can be a, I don't know how to describe it, but it can be a bridge, a bridge to talking about how our personal racism lends to racist policies. But maybe if we warm up around conversations about racist policies, we can get more to the personal contributions that we may make to such policies. By the way, this is not my conception. This is Dr. Kendi's. He thinks that people are people. He thinks that policies ultimately reflect the racism. I don't always understand that, how, people aren't a subject here. If we had Dr. Kendi, I would ask him that. But maybe it's the policies that are the bridge. I've spoken enough. Please, colleagues.
I think one of the participants made a comment about how often doing anti-racism work rests on people of color. And after the brutal killing of George Floyd, we did see a lot that Black and Brown populations, Black and Brown professors were doing a lot of labor on their elite white campuses. So I think perhaps this might be a call to white allies to share the labor. It is laborious, right? So on America's liberal arts campuses, for example, there are only 2 to 3% people of color who are in the professoriate. And so there is extra labor, but that also means it affects their tenure clocks. And so there are lots of repercussions for doing this labor. And so perhaps more conversations with white allies, a sharing of this labor that we do faithfully, but also as people who are invested in this country, who are invested in justice.
Completely co-sign and appreciate what the professor just mentioned. What Dr. Shanila just said about the tax that is being placed upon people of color to solve problems that they did not create without receiving the protection, the power, or the pay to do so is problematic and is dehumanizing in its own way and thingifies, if I can make that word, people in harmful ways that are deface that tend to deface the sacredness of these people and the trauma that we have faced. What I would add to the question and the dialogue around having these courageous conversations is that they have to be, in my estimation, especially in light of our conversation tonight, they cannot be unmoored from one's spirituality and faith practice. This cannot just be a sociological or political conversation. I had the gift of speaking at the St. Chrysostom's Episcopal Church for a 4-week series on Christian discipleship and the problem of racism. And in preaching there, we had the opportunity to also be in dialogue, the rector and myself and the associate rector, after each service for like a virtual coffee hour of sorts. And one thing that became very clear as the conversations went on was the importance of people understanding that this is not something disconnected from the gospel. A lot of people think that, on Sunday, preach to me Jesus, preach the gospel, preach the salvation of the soul, preach forgiveness of sin. Leave this kind of social justice stuff to Saturday. Stick with the gospel on Sunday. And it is because people are somehow able to compartmentalize their individual personal righteousness from a divine conception of justice, right? And as I read through the scriptures, as I try to study them further, I recognize that even the way certain versions of the Bible translate the words righteousness and justice, the Hebrew derivations there are actually often interchanged, right? The same word that is rendered in one space, righteousness, is rendered in another space, justice. In other words, there's no separating this notion of my righteousness, my faith practice, my spirituality, my faithfulness from what justice looks like in the collective. The application of righteousness in the collective life is justice. And helping people recognize that this is a spiritual issue. Mm-hmm. This has not only theological implications for the theologians and the clergy and the lettered religious among us to discuss. This is a matter of people's faith. If they believe in God, if they practice some sort of faithful spiritual practice, they have to see this as tied to their ability to credibly live that faith out. Absolutely. And as long as we leave it over in the kind of parking lot of politics that we don't want to bring into our faith practice, I think we're never going to be able to have the conversations with the force and clarity and pointiness that I think we have to be able to speak to the hearts of people and get them to recognize that perhaps this is the calling of our time.
Mm-hmm. And it really goes back to what Cardinal Superch referred to Paul VI. I mean, saying, if you want peace, you got to work for justice. Mm-hmm. And I think that's absolutely essential.
That's right.
And not just talk about justice, work for justice. Mm-hmm. Any other ideas about having the difficult conversations with our family or colleagues?
Just to put like a super fine point on the idea that Dr. Shanila and I've raised, this is do your homework before you phone your Black or brown friend.
Yes.
Before you reach out to the Black or brown friend expert for their perspective and asking them to rehearse their trauma, do your homework. Demonstrate some commitment to actually figuring this out, because it's a problem that they didn't create. Furthermore, recognize that advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, whether in a corporate context, in an educational context, or wherever you find yourself, a civic context, diversity, equity, and inclusion is a domain of expertise, right? How to build more just organizations and institutions is not just a matter of, well, you've been oppressed, so you're an expert on oppression. Well, yeah, you may understand what it's like to be oppressed. That does not necessarily mean you have the expertise to help navigate an organization or institution forward in resolving these decades, if not centuries old systemic dilemmas, right? No more than my 3-year-old is an expert and qualified to become your chief financial officer because he's familiar with the feeling of a $5 bill in his hand. He's familiar with money, but that does not lead to expertise, right? And so when you have someone like a Dr. Shanila, someone like myself, and others who bring not only their ethnic or racial or religious identity to the table in its underrepresentation or marginalization, but also expertise, don't take that for granted. Because if you're looking for free or cheap Black or brown labor to resolve the issues that kind of sprouted from the dehumanization and slavery that we've seen in our economies, you can't perpetuate it by basically doing that again, right? Asking for free Black and brown labor to solve problems that were not created by Black and brown people. That is a 21st century version of slavery that in the name of social justice, we must be very clear not to reenact.
Right.
Father Wayne,
Yes.
our conversation conjured up a memory for me of an article or a letter that I read of a young woman at Georgetown University who set out to try and delineate between an ally and an accomplice. An ally, she said, is somebody who would put up a poster of Reverend Dr. King on his wall, or might lead a conversation about the poetry of Dr. Maya Angelou. That's great, but it's not going to fix the equity issue on campus. It's not suddenly going to become an advocacy in which you say, hey, there's inequity in hiring practices or in how people are paid. Fundamental gaps in respect. That's not going to happen if we put a poster on our wall. It requires much more energy, much more discomfort. It requires our words and our passion and our action and our presence, and saying this is not okay for anybody. Then maybe we might be more trustworthy as not only allies but accomplices and as co-warriors in the fight against racism and the fight for anti-racism. To be a true champion, you have to put your comfort on the line, your privilege on the line. You have to confess your soul, and that can be painful. So you gotta do it anyway. If you're gonna be a worthy contributor. Now that's hard. It may seem judgmental, and I realize that we have to just keep taking the steps. I tell my friends in my circle of solidarity and anti-racism through ECRA, we talk about staying in the fight. Certain days we may be more elegant in how we fight that fight. Other days we may be sort of inadequate, but stay in, just stay in. Fight won't win itself.
That's great. So right. So we're going to ask one more formal question because we want to leave time for some of the questions that are coming into the question and A and chat box for our amazing panelists. So how can one person, and we've talked a bit about this, but maybe we can get a direct answer. How can one person start a change to make the world more just? What are the components needed to correct a sustainable change for a more just society and culture? How can we do this? Dr. Shanila, you're shaking your head.
So I've been thinking about this, and I think if I would wish that participants take one thing away from today, I think it would be that when we are thinking about racism, that we leave with also thinking about how racism is intimately connected with capitalism. The transatlantic slave trade was ultimately about labor. It was ultimately about accumulation of capital. These bodies were enslaved so that the plantation economy would prosper. women who were repeatedly raped were raped so that they would produce children who then would be labor. And so this is not about motherhood, this was about producing more labor, right? And so I think we have to be mindful that the contemporary forms of racisms that we see are in conversation with these histories. There is a genealogy, and then to figure out how today racism too is tied to capitalism. And so Angela Davis's work, for example, it provides us a very interesting and important understanding of how the prison industrial complex, which continues to enslave people in the modern contemporary era, reproduces this connection between racism and capitalism. And so I think for us to do important social action work inspired by our faith traditions also entails that we actually see racism for what it really is and its connection with capitalism, so that we can also identify the points of interventions, right? So the intervention at the interpersonal level, but the intervention at also the structural levels that all of us have been talking about.
Dr. Nicholas.
I feel like anything I would say would be high-fiving Dr. Shanila across the virtual space. So I don't want to regurgitate or try to build. Yes to everything that she just said.
So be aware of what's happening around you in our society. So I'm just going to toss out a couple of questions and comments from some of the attendees, and maybe, you know, I think all of us are involved in religious in some type of organized religion. So one of our attendees, how can those who identify as religious navigate organized religions that oftentimes indirectly or directly perpetuate racist, sexist, homophobic practices? How do we how would you say someone could do that, navigate their institutions?
So from a Jewish perspective, I'll only speak from a Jewish perspective. Our entire legal structure is built on a culture of disputation, which means argument is good, which means that not everybody agrees. There are definitely perspectives in our Torah, our most original texts, that are very problematic. They are homophobic, they are pro-slavery, they are arguably racist, misogynistic. I mean, you name it. It's like, how on earth are we supporting these scriptures? Well, we don't have to get into all the nuances, but I can assure you that the rabbis struggle with those nuances, and they address them through continued study and proper candor, and the ability to challenge, in this case, Jewish texts for their prejudices, and to recognize that we can reshape those texts in our own time to reflect the moral evolution that we have achieved. That's the best way to do that. Now, does it happen? That depends on the people in the game, in the fight. And that's where it becomes sometimes difficult, and we have to act with proper courage and candor. Is it easy? No. Is it sometimes easier just to keep our mouths shut? Yes. But that doesn't contribute to anti-racism. It promotes racism. So that's a choice. And, you know, choices can be difficult to make, but sometimes the right choice is the only choice. Being anti-racist in this case is the right choice.
Right. So another attendee writes, I'm very aware of not wanting to put that burden on friends, colleagues, of color while I do this work to raise my awareness and consciousness of my privilege and practice of anti-racism. It's my work to do, not theirs. I don't want to avoid the conversation either. How do I do it and be sure I'm not forcing them to relive their painful experiences? Dr. Pierce, as I was formulating this, you said, do our homework before calling your friends. Can you expand on that recommendation?
Absolutely. Thank you for your question. So what I imagine, Dr. Shanila, myself, certainly many other colleagues I have, people are calling us saying, help us fix it. What is it? Racism. Okay. What do you understand to be true about the current state? Well, we're kind of hoping you would help us figure that out. What actually are you trying to solve for? We were hoping you're going to help us figure that out too. Can you just tell us what to do? Can you give us the blue pill? We'll take it. Tell me what to say. I'll say it. Tell me what policy to enact. I'll do it. And you have done no work. You have basically outsourced this to someone else. So the idea of doing your own homework is not relying on that Black or brown friend to rehearse their trauma in order for you to feel like it's close enough to you where it is now verifiable, right? Oftentimes we feel like, oh, that couldn't be happening to Black people. And then you say, well, but I work with one, let me talk to him. And then he says, yeah, oh, yeah, the police pulled me over too. I would have never thought, not you, I thought you were different. Like people look for that proximity to validate other people's experiences and to validate the broader narrative that racism is still alive and well in 2020. So by doing your own work, I'm saying, one, believe the people who have already come forward. This is not fake news.
Right.
Right? This is real. Believe the people whose names have unfortunately become hashtags. Many of them we see behind Rabbi Craig, starting with Emmett Till. And even going back before that with the countless women and men who were enslaved that Dr. Shanila just mentioned. And go back before even there to people who did not survive the transatlantic slave trade, right? Like, let's go back and recognize that these are stories that are not just fake news, made up stories. Let's do our best to embrace this work. I'll give you a perfect example of what I mean by do your own homework. I had a pastor, the church I will not name, who reached out to me and asked me to come in and be the guest speaker for a book club that he was planning to host for some of his parishioners to talk about issues of race and racism. And he wanted his people to read Kendi's book about how to be an anti-racist. And he relented, or I suppose, let me take the story a different way. What he said to me was, I know my guys are not going to read the book. So can you come and talk to them about the book? I said, no,
Yeah.
I'm not. I'm not going to come talk to them about the book. I'm going to let them read the book. And if they have questions they want to ask of me, because I'm in relationship with you, I'm willing to sit and have a conversation. What I'm not willing to do is lift for them what they can lift for themselves because they're being intellectually lazy, and then have to justify all of this because they just don't believe it, because they are threatened by the assertions that such a book would make. Here's what we understand from the research. And I'll be quiet after this. The research is quite clear. When elites, and particularly in this context of this conversation, white people are confronted with the reality of racism in the United States of America, what oftentimes happens, not in every case, obviously not in every case, but more often than not, what tends to happen is that it triggers self-defensiveness. Because when you hear the narrative of racism, what happens is it contests your concept that the US is a meritocracy where everyone has an equal shot to survive and thrive, and that everyone can pull themselves up by the bootstraps. And if they work hard and they can be a rugged individualist, they too can achieve the American dream. And when you recognize that the American dream is being achieved on stolen land that was cultivated by stolen people, it completely kind of shakes your confidence in your ability, and perhaps even the fact that you believe God favored you with the opportunity to build wealth on stolen land, right? And so that now harms your self-concept, and so you clam up. Or you go back in the past and you revise history and you say, well, we don't have those, Jim Crow laws anymore, and there's no colored water fountains anymore. And so, look, I mean, there was a black president. So certainly things have progressed. And so you will revise history to say, well, we've come so far without regard for how far we have to go. This is why this is a theological issue. God's standard of justice has not moved. So we are not to measure ourselves against a standard of how far we've come. We were in deep, deep sin. Now we're in shallow sin. The standard is, where is God's bar? And then we measure ourselves against how far we are from the standard of God. And if we haven't made it yet,
keep working.
No one is righteous. No, not one. No one is perfect. Yet, we cannot claim victory until we have truly, truly met the divine standard. And until then, which is in our tradition, no one's going to make it until they get called home, till their life's journey on earth is done. You got to keep working at it. And part of that is not outsourcing that work to third parties.
Amen. So can I just do one quick follow-up, and then I'm going to ask you, Dr. Shanila, to add to that. I received a message from someone who dialed in, so I got it on my text, a question. You mentioned homework, and I think that's so important, not to just drag people out or trot them before us. So what would you say, any of you really, but Dr. Nicholas for sure, do you have any recommendations for books or essays that would help us white people to do our homework?
I would actually defer to Rabbi Craig, because Rabbi Craig has done a lot of homework by virtue of the conversations I've had with him, by virtue of how he's even showing up tonight. And so, again, I'm not trying to hijack moderation, but I wonder, Rabbi, if you could share perhaps some of how you've gotten to the space that you currently occupy, in your comfort level, your conviction around having the conversation. What resources have you found helpful? Like, what have you done?
Thank you, Dr. Nicholas. So I changed my screen. You'd be surprised how powerful this little baby book is, called Anti-Racist Baby. I think that's the first book anybody should read. Not everybody agrees with it being like the end-all be-all direction. I happen to be really moved by it, and so I stand by it. So just a small disclaimer there. I do believe that working with fellow clergy in ECRA, we meet weekly, by the way, on Tuesdays sometimes and on Wednesdays sometimes, depends on the week, it rotates. But we have a conversation, a regular conversation about matters of anti-racism and religion, prayer, and so on. And we challenge each other to figure out, okay, we've resolved to stay in the fight. How are we going to do that? And so we encounter all sorts of things like Dr. Kendi's work, and we study it, and we learn about it. We commit to a culture of learning, a practice of learning. And we recognize that it's best for us to try and teach one another, not delegate it to someone who represents a marginalized people, or someone who can come and help us solve the problems that we need to do our part to solve. And so the other thing is that's a huge job, anti-racism and racial justice and any other justice that draws marginalized people back into the heart of humanity, where everyone deserves to be, because we're created in God's image and full of intrinsic worth. We deserve to be there. So we use our religious ideas and principles in addition to more modern understandings of the work that needs to be done. And we just stay in the fight. We just keep at it, you know? And like I said before, some days we have a ton of clarity and direction. Other days it's murkier, and we just don't quite know what to do. The last thing I'll say, because I could probably say a lot of things, it's important to expand the circle. Our circle is small and mighty and engaged and consistent. But as we said before, these jobs are huge. So while we don't have to finish the job ourselves, we're not free to desist from it. So that's a Jewish teaching, by the way. So we try to hang in there with one another. And if we had more people in the circle, I know we could hang in longer. I fully expect to stay in the fight forever.
Right.
Or I hope it's not forever, to tell you the truth, but.
Thanks, Rabbi. Dr. Shanila, any ideas? You're a professor.
Yes.
Give that some homework.
So I think I draw a lot from Black feminists. I will just paste in an article from Bell Hooks. I think Black feminists have done amazing work. Bell Hooks, Patricia Hill Collins, Kimberly Crenshaw. And I think it helps us to understand Blackness in multiple ways structurally, but also as an embodied experience. The trauma that Dr. Nicholas was talking about, it's carried in the Black body. So this is not something, a trade that happened centuries ago. It actually leaves a mark in our soul and our bodies. And so I think that's one place I would start. I think another thing, which as you all were talking about, all of us have spaces of privilege and spaces where we feel marginalized, right? And so I think insofar as we can engage in a self-reflection around spaces of privilege, it could be our gender, it could be our class, it could be our sexuality, it could be the fact that I'm at an American university, it could be our education, right? We have multiple domains that we move in and out of. And I think contemplating on those circles of privilege that God has awarded us access to, how might we utilize those in order to actually enhance work for social justice? And so I think individually doing that work to critically think about, is it my purchasing power? Like I think the op-ed that Father Wayne, you talked about, one of the things that stood out for me was that in addition to learning, the person also said she's going to donate to Black causes, right? And so that reflection on what is it that I can do, what is the privilege, and then advance it, draw on it for social justice.
Well, we completely filled our time. I haven't, there go the bells in my in my apartment. But I just want to take this opportunity to thank everyone for joining. If people who are participants have ideas how we can continue the fight, more opportunities for us to get together in environments like this or others, please don't hesitate to send a note to Noreen Russo, who's going to put her email address, has put her email address in the chat box. But really, I'm so very grateful for your wisdom, for your knowledge. It's fun to see you. Those of the two of you I know pretty well. It's great to see you again. I wish I could be back in your class, Dr. Nicholas. I'll find a way to sneak in. Now that we have Sally Blount as our CEO, maybe she can find a way to get me in your class. But really, I'm impressed and grateful beyond measure. I thank those who have joined tonight, and we'll be together again. If any of the panelists want to say a final word, and then we'll say thank you and goodbye.
Thank you for creating this space. It was, as Rabbi Craig said, I think this fellowship is important, and this is perhaps only the first step for all of us to continue.
Thank you very much. It's been a joy.
Thank you all. Many blessings. And remember, stay in the fight.
Stay in the fight. Silent no more.
Thank you, Father Wayne. Thank you,
Thank you,
Dr.
everybody.
Camila. Thank you, Dr. Nicholas.
Bye.
Thank you, Noreen.
Thanks, Noreen.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you, Pam.